Good evening. You're watching The Digital Age, and I'm James Goodale. Got a great show for you tonight, and the issue we want to discuss is, can we end censorship on the net, or at least can we get around it? You know, there's lots of censorship, not in the United States, but in foreign countries, Cuba, China, you name it. But how can we end it? How can we beat it? And tonight, here from Toronto to discuss that question is a real expert, who's Ronald Deibert, who's director of the Citizens Lab at the University of Toronto, which also has under its aegis the Open Net Initiative, which is a consortium of various universities who are trying to beat censorship. And it's not just as academic as all of that sounds, because when we get on into the show, we will talk about something that Mr. Deibert has actually almost, if not in fact, invented. But let's start off by thinking about censorship on the net. When the net first started, let's say a decade ago, maybe more than that, a lot of people thought this was the promise of the future, because you would be able to democratize those countries that don't have real democracy. In fact, we did a show way back then, Can the Net Topple China? Well, there was great hope. But now we are here many years later, and it seems as though censorship actually is on the rise in many, many countries. How do we explain that? What happened?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a great honor to be here. And just to answer your question, it's true that it is on the rise. The research that I've done along with my colleagues at Harvard, Oxford, and Cambridge, we've been working on documenting patterns of internet censorship now for about 5 years. And when we started, we were looking only at a handful of countries, the obvious ones: China, Iran, Saudi Arabia. In our last round of research, we did research in 41 countries worldwide and found evidence of content filtering in 26 of them. Right now, as we speak, I have researchers in 71 countries worldwide who are doing the type of research that we do, so I suspect that number will be much larger. There's a great momentum around the world behind intervening in the internet environment, and I think the hopes that people had that you referred to before probably had a lot to do with, in part, it being a myth, that people had great hopes about this technology, that it was somehow mysterious, magical, that governments couldn't control it. President Clinton, for example, said with respect to Chinese attempts to filter the internet, you can't do it. It's like, you know, throwing Jell-O against a wall, I think is the phrase. Yes, yes. In fact, though, I think what's happened is that initially governments took a hands-off approach. They wanted to, for various reasons, encourage the growth of information and communication technologies for economic development purposes. So we mistook their hands-off for their inability to do something about it. But over the last decade, really since 2001, there's been a sea change in terms of how governments approach the internet. And what they're doing is they're lifting the lid on it, so to speak. And I think to explain how it's going on, you have to understand how the internet works.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you, as you explain what you're just about to explain, and you can answer perhaps in that answer is, what in God's name have the foreign countries figured out that makes them so effective?
Well, it's not really that difficult, actually. I think the place to begin is by thinking about how most people approach the internet. I think the vast majority of people, when they think about the internet, they don't think much beyond the computer screen in front of them. They send an email and it goes off magically and it appears on somebody else's screen, and same when you make a request for a website. But if you actually took the time and followed that request for information down the fiber optic cable, it would go to a router in the building in which you're located, and then off to an internet service provider, and then to an internet exchange point, and to an international gateway, down an undersea fiber optic cable, maybe up to a satellite that's orbiting in space. Every step along the way, there are filters, choke points, you might say, where governments or other authorities can intervene and either block access to information or monitor communications. Now, in terms of monitoring communications...
Well, can I just ask you about that? See, the obvious one, most people will understand the easiest, is going into the cable. Do they actually go into the cable under the sea and screw around with that?
That's by far the most difficult,
the hardest.
in fact. Yeah.
Then you talk about routers. Sometimes routers puts everyone apart, but the way that works simply spoken is that you split up your information and it travels around some packets, then it's reassembled, and it goes in digital form. That's why we have the digital age. Now, and Cisco, for those who are familiar with Cisco, may have owned its stock, for better or for worse, is a big provider of those routers.
Absolutely, yeah.
And what do they get a hold of? Do they get a hold of the router and actually, what do they, stick a knife in it?
All routers are programmed in such a way as to manage the traffic that flows through them. And some of that is for purely technological efficiency reasons. You want to block access to spam or viruses, and there are all sorts of alerts that go out. You want to prevent mal requests from going through and that sort of thing. It's simple to program into those routers a series of websites or IP addresses, and simply say when this request comes through for this website, don't let it go through.
How do you get in, if you're a foreign government, how do you get into the, how do you get inside a router with a...
Well, you use proxies, in effect. And,
you put a proxy...
Well,
we want to talk proxies at the end, but...
I mean, not a proxy in a technical sense. I mean, an institutional sense. You go to the internet service providers who are operating in your country, and you pass down a law, or you know, in other ways, in some countries it's very secretive, pass down a regulation of some sort, and the technical people have to implement it, which often results in enormous errors, collateral filtering, because the way in which the regulations are implemented can be very heavy-handed and clumsy. Now, the other thing is programming routers is one thing.
Does censorship depend on the ability and training of those in a particular country? In other words, would censorship be better in China because they're better educated than the people in Ghana? On this, or doesn't that make any difference?
Well, it may affect the style in which the filtering takes place. In a lot of countries, it's a bit more crude and implemented in a heavy-handed way. And in fact, some countries where you'd expect there to be heavy censorship, for example, Russia, the way in which they deal with the problems is much more blunt, let's say. Rather than filter access to some opposition website, they just go out and arrest the opposition. In China, it is, of course, a very heavily networked society. You have the world's second largest internet population, soon to be the first. It's a very economically networked country as well. So they depend on information and communication technologies, but they want to balance that with trying to control access to political.
We've done several programs on China, one of which I referred to a few minutes ago. We did one with Ambassador Lord, and he's been ambassador to China, and I mean, he said to me candidly, I just don't know how effective it is. Is it effective in China, the censorship?
Well, it depends.
Can they really get it?
Effective with respect to what? In terms of very savvy people who know how to get around it, it's not effective. And in fact, it's quite simple, depending on how it's implemented, to get around it. But you have to have special skills, or maybe connections to computers outside of the country. It is very effective, though, when it's combined with, as in the case of China, a heavy regulatory environment, maybe some stiff penalties for those who are caught transgressing them. So in other words, you throw a few people in jail and make a cause out of them, and it scares others. So you create a climate of self-censorship. And of course, for the vast majority of people, what they don't know, they're missing. They just don't know exists. So it's an
elitist group that's able to
for the most
beat
part.
The system, but in terms of
very small
keeping
proportion.
the masses down, which is what China wants to do, they're able to do it. Now, recently there was a story on the front page of the New York Times about Cuba, and you read that story, and you got the impression that everyone's beating the system in Cuba. Was that an accurate reflection as you see it?
No.
New York Times wrong again.
No, I'm not going to say that. I think it's a bit more nuanced, is the way I would say it, because although you do have all of these filters in place, there are strong regulations for those who are caught violating it. And also, it's very difficult to get internet access in that country. It's very expensive. There's a black market for it. Connectivity's poor in that country because of the U.S. embargo. A lot of companies aren't allowed to connect to the networks in Cuba. So you have all of this constraint around internet access on top of everything that Cuba is doing. But that said, there is a really dynamic movement of civil society in that country, like in many of the countries, China, Iran, where you have this filtered internet environment. People who are willing to take the risks, who understand how to get around it, are beginning to educate others, and they're working with groups like mine outside of the country to network and share tools and strategies and so forth.
How good a censorship system does Iran have?
Well, good is,
from their point of view.
From their point of view. Well, let me say this. They are a pervasive filter of internet content. And the way in which we test, by that I mean the Open Net Initiative, we run a series of software tests inside the country. We have tools that we connect to the ISPs and we run checks for thousands of websites and keywords and IP addresses. In every category that we test in, Iran blocks at least something. So they're one of the most pervasive filters. They block political opposition, women's rights.
So the Open Net Initiative, which has the universities to which I referred earlier in the program, you have a group at each university, or is it just at the University of Toronto that you're collected?
This is a large transnational research organization. We have about 80 researchers worldwide. There are the 4 universities at the core who manage and administer this, but we network with dozens of non-governmental organizations.
So you're really, you're a human rights organization in some respects.
It's a curious hybrid, yeah.
Yeah, because many human rights organizations monitor censorship and make a big noise about it. Do you make a big noise about or isn't that your mission?
Well, there are 2 differences between what we do and what maybe an advocacy organization like Reporters Without Borders would do. First of all,
or the Committee to Protect Journalists, of which I was once chairman.
Sure, and actually, these I'm not slighting in any way these other ones. It's just a difference. One is we're very technically focused. We have network interrogation tools that our researchers run from within the countries that in effect lift the lid on the internet. One of my colleagues described what we do as taking an MRI of the internet. So there's a lot of risk to that. Some of the people who do the research in the countries that we do research in, it's considered espionage, right? So this is serious stuff.
Is it really?
Sure. I mean, you're violating national, local laws, right?
Espionage to figure out how the internet works?
Well, when you're checking access to websites that are on a blacklist that are considered a violation.
Really? Just if you just check it, you're in.
People have been thrown in jail, have been threatened.
Just to check it?
Absolutely.
I mean, you go on and you find it. Well,
you're doing more than checking, right?
Yeah.
We're running a series of tools that is mapping, some of the most sensitive parts of the information environment that the government wants to control. This is not just someone stumbling across Human Rights Watch or Committee to Protect Journalists. It's a researcher who's got a tool. They're plugging it into an ISP. It's connecting to databases back in Canada, and it's running a series of tests. I mean, that's can certainly be interpreted as espionage, let's say. All that's to say that this is very technical and precise. We're very empirical, and it relates to another difference that our organization has from these other groups, is that we try to be as objective about our findings. We don't actually go out and say, this is good or bad. We just try to lift a lid on what's going on and shed a light on what's happening, and then it gives ammunition.
You're not a real advocacy.
We try to
a group as such,
and it was deliberate. We set it up because advocacy organizations were making charges against governments like China and Iran. The governments would just either dismiss or ignore it. So what we wanted to do is create an impartial, university-based research project that could say with certainty what these governments are doing, allow others to take the evidence and do what they want with it. So we've been partnered with advocacy organizations.
Now, here's a dumb question, but I'll make it a little bit provocative. We care about China because it's a huge internet country, but I have to assume of these countries of which you've spoken, the internet penetration is very, very small. For example, Burma was very much in the news not so long ago, with respect to what the papers called an internet revolution.
Yeah.
But what, in fact, is the penetration in Burma?
Burma is one of the least connected countries in the world. In fact, it has less than 1% internet.
Less than 1%?
Less than 1%. And then on top of that is among the most heavily filtered internet countries. Internet cafes are heavily monitored. So when people talked about the internet playing an important part in what went on there, I think you have to understand that a lot of that had to do with it was primarily for foreign consumption. A lot of the people.
What do you mean by that, for foreign consumption?
Well, the people in Burma weren't actually watching the videos and images coming out through YouTube and internet sites that we did here. We were spectators of this revolution, right? It was largely a spontaneous grassroots revolution, but there were a few well-trained individuals who were able to document what's going on and expose it to the outside world, which in turn put pressure on Burma. And then Burma, of course, took the drastic measure of shutting off the internet entirely for about a 2-week period.
Is that why we are mostly interested in these countries? That if you cut off the internet, we can't find, the international community can't find out about them?
Well, I hope it's a bit of that, but also having to do with human rights. I mean, in my case, for example, when I see monks peacefully demonstrating somewhere in the world and there's a violent crackdown, I think it's objectionable. So I'm glad that we were able to see what was going on and witness what was happening. But ultimately, it didn't stop the authorities from doing what they were doing.
Well, because you only had international pressure.
Yeah.
You really couldn't. With that small access, will that build up internal pressure? It's too small to build up internal pressure.
I don't think you could equate it to what has gone on in other places like the colored revolutions of the former Soviet Union, where the internet and cell phones, even with relatively low penetration there, it played a much greater role in mobilizing people. People just aren't as connected in that country as they are in other parts of the world. Now, that said, the internet does play an important part in connecting the people within Burma to networks outside. So you have people who go out for training, who receive technology so they can document what's going on. I think over time you'll see a momentum building. At least that's what I hope.
What is sort of the average penetration of these countries you're looking at, leaving out Russia and China?
Very low.
Very low.
Most developing countries have, low internet penetration, rudimentary connections. A lot of them are dial-up environments, not bandwidth like we're talking about here. However, a lot of them are making the leap to the cellular environment. There are now 3.3 billion cell phones in the world, so that there's a lot of cell phones, and most of those are.
Let's get this straight in my head. A cell phone effectively connects you to the internet, right?
It does now, right?
And so when you talk about, say, 1% penetration in Burma, would that include the cell phones that have been?
I'm not sure about Burma, yeah, but
but the big penetration increase would come from cell phones, you're suggesting?
It will. It is, and it will, I think, increasingly, because many. If you travel a lot in the developing world, you see that the cell phones are everywhere, and people are using them different ways. Texting is very important. They connect to the internet in different ways because they access the internet through wireless networks. Now, what you're seeing, of course, is authorities beginning to target those services. In the lead up to the Cambodian election, for example, the government shut off all SMS messaging for a period of time leading up to that election.
Let's talk about this invention for which you've been receiving awards. Do I pronounce it Siphon?
Siphon, that's right.
It's spelled P-S-I-P-H-O-N.
There's a silent P we put in there.
I thought it was, but I wanted to ask. Anyway, Siphon. This is, as I read about it, this is a very exciting, can I call it an invention, which in a sense beats censorship. Can you explain how it works?
Well, I wouldn't quite go so far as to call it an invention, because the team that put this together, and I'm just a part of a team, I don't want to take credit for it, we have been doing research on internet censorship for a long time, and we realized that the ways in which people were getting around internet censorship had various shortcomings. They were either insecure, difficult to use, and what we did with Siphon was create something that was, first of all, very easy to use. You don't have to be a technology geek in order to be able to use this. We wanted to make it very secure, and we wanted to make it difficult for governments to block. So the way it works is it actually begins in an uncensored country, like say the United States. Someone here downloads Siphon on their home computer.
Okay, what do you call it? It's software that you
software.
That
it's
you
a very small software
application.
application.
Anyone in the audience could download it.
Anyone in the audience can download it, and the idea here is you have a few trusted friends or family members who live in one of these countries.
In a censored country.
Yeah, and let's say it's a cousin of yours in Iran, and what you do is you give them the connection information to your Siphon-enabled computer once you install it. And instead of trying to access banned content, they connect to your computer, and through an encrypted channel, it goes out, fetches the information for them, and sends it back to them, so they're not connecting directly and hitting the firewall of the governments.
Is this what we referred to way back when as a form of proxy server?
Yes, it's a proxy
server. So it was thought at the dawn of the internet that one of the reasons we would have a toppling of China is that you could always get around the firewalls with a proxy server. Now apparently that didn't happen because here Siphon isn't that old. When did Siphon?
We released it last year.
So it's last year, and this is notable, else you wouldn't be here talking about it. It's one of the reasons you're talking to me about Siphon. So what happened to all those other proxy servers?
Well, they
that
still
were supposed
exist.
to topple China.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of enthusiasm around this stuff, and even Siphon that we have to kind of dampen down a bit. These are just different methods and tools working towards helping people get around internet censorship, but governments are very concerted about their filtering efforts, and a lot of people to this day don't know about tools like Siphon. The thing about the proxies that you refer to, and really their Achilles heel, is that the way in which they're traditionally used is that an organization will set up a proxy and then broadcast the information in to the Chinese citizens through, say, Voice of America. The citizens will hear about the connection information to that proxy. They'll use it for a while, but of course the government can hear those very same broadcasts, and after a while they put the proxy on a blacklist and a new proxy has to be set up. So it's a constant kind of cat and mouse game.
Are there a whole lot? Is that going on now, or are people
it's
giving
going
up?
On, oh no,
it always goes on.
Yeah,
and what happens if you're caught using a proxy?
Well, you know, it's hard to say because some of the proxies could actually be set up by the government itself, and you wouldn't know it. I mean, it's very insecure, right? Yeah. So, and they catch people for violating laws all the time. There, you don't know why or how they catch.
Do they go to jail for using proxy servers?
I haven't heard of anything like that, although often you do see it added on to a list of charges.
Can they go to jail for using yours? I guess you don't know the answer to that
question. Well, I don't
question either.
Certainly they could, right?
Okay,
I mean,
well,
possible.
So if I understand the difference between all those proxy servers that are out there and ones that are in the past and yours, is that yours is discrete.
Yes.
And it's given to a small group of trusted people, right?
Yeah. Well, in order to do that, we had to make it easy to use. You see, these other ones, to set it up, it's quite an ordeal. You have to be a computer programmer to set up a proxy server. It's several laborious steps.
Right.
With ours, I'm sure you could do it. You could go home tonight.
Even me?
Listen, I'm a political scientist and I can do it. It's very simple, and we wanted to make it simple precisely to tap into the large constituency of average computer users out there, especially ones who have familial relations.
Right.
They're part of an ethnic diaspora network that extends into these.
Now, how does it, if I'm in Iran and somehow I've heard about it, maybe I have a family member here, and I want to give it to somebody else in Iran, I have to meet it, I have to tell them?
Yeah, well, you know, you have to
email them, do you?
Well, you could. It depends on how closely you're monitored. I mean, we don't want to exaggerate the extent to which governments are watching everything, But you do have to know someone outside of the country, right? You need someone in Canada or the United States or the UK who you know and trust. It's very important. I mean, you don't want to connect to a proxy server where there's Siphon or anything.
They'll get in there and use their secret service, and all of a sudden you're dead.
Well, let's hope not. That's why ours is encrypted. A lot of these others are not.
Does the encryption make that much of a difference?
Absolutely.
Okay, I've given it to. You're my brother in U.S. I'm your brother in Iran.
Yeah.
We got 3 brothers, and I give it to the 3rd brother. Now there's 2 of us in Iran. So somehow the government catches wind of the fact we're using this, and why don't they just haul us away? What difference?
Well,
the encryption? They could haul us away.
What difference the encryption makes is that they can't monitor traffic and look for keywords or evidence that you're visiting banned sites, because all they'll see is a computer in Iran is connecting to a computer in the United States over an encrypted channel, which presumably happens millions of times a day, let's say, because of all of the electronic transactions that go on.
Oh, I see. So the encryption...
It's like a banking transaction.
So the person in China who's using a proxy server is using it without encryption? Well, he could use it.
A lot of them are in plain text.
Why couldn't they just use their own, just encrypt what they're sending to the proxy, so it's just the same as yours?
A lot of the proxies are not set up in such a way that they're encrypted. I could give you...
In other words, they wouldn't connect with an encryption.
No, in fact, there's a horrible story that comes from our own research where the U.S. government had set up a proxy service for Iranians, very much like what we're talking about here. They advertised it over Radio Farda. And so we connected to this service from within Iran, and we found out that the connections were in plain text, so easily interceptable. And of course, the authorities are listening to the same broadcasts as the dissidents. But also, perversely, the government had insisted that they put in place porn filters on the proxy service because they couldn't justify Iranians surfing for porn on a system that was set up, paid for by U.S. taxpayers. So we found out the filters were very crude and they were blocking access to GeorgeWBush.com because of the keyword Bush, right? They were filtering themselves.
But look, you say the system weakness with respect to the Voice of America telling everybody how to use the proxy system is obvious. But isn't the converse of that in your situation that no one knows about it?
Yeah, I mean, you're working. It's not that no one knows about it.
Well,
let me tell you. I mean,
I just put you on to make you feel bad a little bit.
It's a different model of dissemination. Instead of shouting it from the hilltops, you instead work from the grassroots. You work with human rights organizations. You work in a campaign of outreach below the radar, so to speak. Right. So you encourage people, mostly in the West. You say, do you have a friend or family member who wants to access the internet?
How do you find
you can do this for them.
How many helps? Can you tell me how many you got out there?
Well, I can tell you how many nodes have been downloaded. As of 2 weeks ago, last time I checked, there's about 150,000 of them.
150,000.
Right? So let's say each of those are giving access to 10 people. You can do the math yourself.
All right, believe it or not, we've come to the end.
Well,
I want to know who's going to win this battle. Are you going to win it with your proxy server and others in a similar situation, or the government's going to win the battle?
I think ultimately we're going to win here. I think we're in a very serious battle right now, as you call it, because governments are waking up to what they can do with respect to the internet. And we have been living in this climate of fear for the last decade, and there's very much a sense that the war on terror, concerns about security, is driving government intervention into the internet all across the world. And I'm hoping that the pendulum will swing back and people will recognize that we need to protect the internet as a forum for free expression and access to information.
And we'll do it with Siphon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ron, for coming by. And thank you for coming by. Come by next week and learn more about the digital age. For the digital age, I'm James Goodale. Good night and have a good week.